Tonight we'll be looking at the Occupy movement as part of this glimpse and slice of Turkey today, especially the events over the summer. We'll be discussing them. And I'd like to welcome our panel, which includes Anya Schiffrin. She's the Director of International Media, Advocacy and Communications Specialization at the School of International and Public Affairs at Columbia. She's the author of the great books Bad News, How America's Business Press Missed the Story of the Century. This is about how the business press missed the warning signs of the financial crisis. And for tonight, most relevantly, the book From Cairo to Wall Street, Voices of the Global Spring. Both are published by the New Press. Welcome, Anya. And yeah, you can have a seat if you like. Maybe everyone can come up as I read your quick bio. I'd also like to welcome Yates McKee. He's an art historian and an activist, and he was involved in the Occupy Wall Street movement. Since 2011, he's got a stack of magazines here which he edits, which is called Tidal, Occupy Theory, Occupy Strategy. So everyone be sure to take a copy. I'd also like to welcome Hayrettin Günç, who is an architect and an activist. He was living in Istanbul until recently. He moved to Boston to study architecture at the GSD. He runs an organization called Architecture for All, and he'll be presenting his project this evening called Occupy Gezi Architecture. And you can't have missed our Inflatable General Assembly, which you passed through. I hope you enjoyed it. Greta Hansen and Adam Koogler and Kyung-Jae Kim of Common Practice created this for the occasion. We're really excited about it. Common Practice is a new firm. They've displayed their work at Storefront for Art and Architecture, and next year their work will be on display at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London in a show called Disobedient Objects. And be sure to take this piece of paper, which tells you more about Inflatable General Assembly. And sorry to be so long-winded, but we're going to begin our evening with a screening of a short film, In the Key of Gezi, by the filmmakers Elif and Arianna LaPenne. And can you, right here. And Elif is a PhD candidate in sociology at Columbia, and so we'll screen this film, and everybody can have a seat, and everyone will be available for a Q&A after. And Elif, it'd be great if you could join for that Q&A as well.
Herkes toplansın ben ve eylemciler yatın yere hadi. Hayır herkes toplansın. Sık bakalım. Sık bakalım.
Sorry about that.
Bir herkesi sık bakalım. Kaskını çıkar. Herkes toplansın ben ve eylemciler yatın yere hadi. Hayır herkes toplansın. Sık bakalım. Sık bakalım. Bir herkesi sık bakalım. Kaskını çıkar.
Ortalık toz duman şu anda. Evet, o beklenen müdahale başladı.
Gezi Parkı dağıldıktan sonra arkadaşım Abbas Ağa Parkı'nda da bayağı ciddi bir kalabalık var dedi. O gelişimden sonra da orada olmaya devam etti. Gezi direnişi bir tohumun filizlenmesiydi. Ağacın farklı dallarının aynı gövdeye bağlı kalmasını sağlayacak bir şey park formu.
18 gibi işten çıkıyorum, eve geliyorum. Sonra üzerimi değiştiriyorum, yemek yiyip parka geliyorum. Bütün özel hayatımı parktaki yaşama göre ayarlıyorum. Bu çok önemli, özverili bir durum benim adıma. Ama canını kaybeden insanlar var. O yüzden bu yaptıklarımız çok da büyük bir şeyler değil. Buraya gelmek, burada bulunmak. Ama en azından bunu da yapmalıyız.
Şu anda Park Meclisi'nin Twitter hesabını yönlendiriyorum. AKP'lilerin bize karşı sert bir duruşu var. Bunu kırmaya çalışıyoruz. Her gün yeni bir yalanla karşılaşıyoruz bizimle ilgili. Doğruları göstererek yalanlayacağız. O nedenle ötürü bu adresleri kullanıyoruz.
Bana göre forumlar bir hayat üniversitesi. Belli şeyleri biliyorum. Ama bazen forumda ben çok şey öğreniyorum. Okul bana göre. Yani ortak paydada birleştikleri bir şey var ki bu insanlar parklarda toplanıp duruyor.
Arkadaşlar yarınki gündemimiz de gezi olacak. Hani nasıl aramızda konuşurken heyecanlanıyorsak bu konuda burada da söyleyecek çok şeyimiz olduğunu düşünüyorum. Konuşmak isteyen var mı?
Bizim için de burada Gezi'den önce ve Gezi'den sonra var. Mesela Gezi'den önce ne yapıyordum? Televizyon seyrediyordum. Artık seyretmiyorum. Gezi'den önce insanlarla çok fazla diyaloğa girmiyordum, merhaba demiyordum. Şimdi herkese merhaba diyorum. Çok mutluyum o yüzden.
Toprak altında çok fazla kültür barındıran ülkeler çok zorluklar yaşarlar. Onun için de gezi olaylarında herkes muhalefet. Herkesin bir acısı var bu devlete karşı. Bu ölene kadar devam eder. Benim yaşımda da, küçüklerimin de, büyüklerimin de.
Gezi sürecinin, hatta Gezi sürecinin de dışında Türkiye siyasetinin üzerine kafa yorarak farklı düşünceden insanları hangi üslupla bir araya getirebiliriz? Bunu tartışıyoruz aslında. Gezi ruhu, gezi ruhu diyoruz ya. O ruhun bir bedene girmesi lazım. O da zaman alacak. Bir ruhun vücut bulması kolay değil.
Bir sürü etnik grup var. Bütün bu gruplar aslında normalde aynı mahallelerde yaşardık biz. Ama büyüyünce işler değişti. Büyüdüğümüzde ise tekrar yeniden o çocukluğumuzda yan yana durduğumuz dostlarımızı arar hale geldik. O sokakta oyun oynadığımız arkadaşlarımızı bu sefer alanlarda bulmaya başladık. Yani bizde Kürt ve Türk ayrımı diye bir şey olmadığını biliyoruz. Basın hala bunun altını çiziyor. Aslında böyle bir şey yok.
Benim işim bana diyor ki gitme artık. Bak sana da bir şey yapacaklar diyor. Ben de diyorum ki benim de 19 yaşında bir oğlum var. Ya ona da bir şey yaparlarsa? O zaman da gitmeyecek miydik? O anne nasıl üzülüyorsa biz onun üzüntüsünü kendi içimizde yaşayıp oraya gitmek zorundayız. O yüzden ben geliyorum buraya ve gelmeye devam edeceğim.
Delikanlı kim bakalım? Sık bakalım, sık bakalım. Birer gazı sık bakalım. Kaskını çıkar, jopunu bırak. Delikanlı kim bakalım? Varsa cesaret çık karşımıza. Sen gitmeden bitmez bu kavga.
So, do the speakers maybe want to come up? Grab a seat? It's quite noisy.
great. Can people hear me? In the back, can you hear me? Nod or, okay, great. Thank you. So I think I'm starting, is that right? I'm Anya Schiffrin, and I teach at Columbia. I run the Media and Communications program at the School of International and Public Affairs. So I have no architects in my life, and I was really excited when I got invited to come here tonight. I usually think about media and journalism, so this is a great change, and thank you for having me. And I love the Occupy. How many people in this room have lived or visited Istanbul? Hands, please. Okay, great. So a lot of you know what an amazing city we're talking about. I thought I'd start by giving, since I'm the first, I guess it's my job to give a bit of an overview. This book that I edited after the protests of 2011 is a collection of essays by protesters from all around the world, from all the different Occupy movements. So it includes Greece, Athens, Madrid, Cairo, Tunisia, all kinds of places, and of course Occupy Wall Street. And one of the things that, there were so many points that the people from those Occupy movements and revolutions had in common. And I thought I would just talk about two of them this evening. One is the question of space, because that's the subject, and physical space, and then also the question of the media, which was alluded to here in the film. And the essays that people wrote for us in this book talked a lot about what it meant to take over a space. And it turned out that for so many people in the Occupy movement all around the world, space was unbelievably important for them. It turned out, and I never would have actually guessed this, that just having a place where you could go and be with other people was very, very liberating. And over again, the people in this book talk to us about when they went to the space, they became somebody different than who they had been before. In Tunisia, in Greece, in Egypt, people had been afraid, people had been unhappy, people had known the system was broken, but it wasn't until they got to the shared space that they were actually able to connect. And what they all said was that social media broke down the fear barrier, but it was being in the space and living with other people and talking to them that for the first time they felt that they knew who their neighbors were. The space also became a place where they could experiment and try new things. And that meant, as you know, a very sort of consensus form of decision making and of discussion. And in a way, that became the undoing of some of these movements, because they spent so much time happily in the space talking to each other about being in the space that they didn't go out and do the sort of political organizing that might have helped change those societies. But the space was something that just came up over and over again. So I thought I would observe that. Another point about space is that when you have a space, you can have images and you can make film and video and you can get your message out. If you don't have a space or something to show, it's much harder to do messaging. And it turned out that the people that did the protesting and occupied all these spaces needed to get their messages out because the mainstream media wasn't doing it for them. And I thought that that part of the film was actually very relevant, not just for Turkey, and I will talk about the media in Turkey, but also in many other countries. I'm sure some of you will remember when Occupy Wall Street started, how even though it was covered on local television in New York, it was basically ignored at first by the New York Times. And then there was a very sort of early patronizing piece about Occupy, and then the New York Times kind of reversed itself and started covering the protests. And as you know, this was what happened all over the world. In Turkey, I'm sure you've heard all the sort of famous stories about when the protests started in Istanbul, mainstream television basically refused to cover it and even had things like documentaries about life on planet Mars and things like that instead of actually the news from what was going on in Gezi. So I wanted to highlight that. and talk a little bit about the media in Turkey and how and what the climate there is like. I moved to Istanbul in 1989, and as you will remember, Turkey had several military coups, and the last one was in 1980. So when I got there, it was still a place with a lot of fear. Anybody pretty much who'd been, a lot of protesters, tens and thousands of people, the numbers are still in dispute, had been arrested. And if you were arrested, that meant you were tortured. So all the people I worked with at the newspaper where I worked had been tortured. I met people whose husbands and partners were in jail for 750 years for covering the Kurds. And I don't know how many of you know about that topic and how divisive it's been in Turkish society. But it was a place that was a very, in some ways fearful, and in some ways trapped in the past, which meant also that it was physically very beautiful. I don't know how many people here have lived in dictatorships or visited dictatorships? No? Okay, well, yes. So some of you know what I'm talking about, right? My family's from Spain, so I spent lots of time there under Franco, and I've lived in Vietnam, and I've traveled to Cuba. So when you go to places that are very closed or authoritarian, they are physically gorgeous because they're so isolated from the rest of the world. And so Istanbul was a place that had not yet been overdeveloped, McDonaldized, and built up in the way that you can see in this film. It was a very Mediterranean city, an extremely, also alluded to in the film, multicultural place. It's certainly, I'm glad so many of you have been, because you know it's one of the most beautiful cities in the world, easily, and that you can spend literally years exploring all the different spaces that are there. The synagogues, the mosques, the churches. The grocery stores smelled like Spain smelled in the 1970s, that smell of sort of tangerines and soap powder. So there was always a huge, rich kind of history that was there, and some beginning projects where people were starting to develop some of the houses and some of the parks, and you'll remember some of the NGOs that were working on that. And there was also a lot of sort of jazz and clearly an intellectual life. The area near where the square is, as you know, 100 years ago, people barely spoke Turkish in that neighborhood. That was a neighborhood where people spoke French and Italian, because Turkey's obviously always had strong connections to the Levant. And then what happened was Istanbul, and I guess I'll close soon because there's other people here that want to talk, but what happened was Istanbul didn't change for a very, very long time. It changed in some ways, but not that much. So new construction was on the edge of the city, not the heart. And in the last probably 10 years, I would say, maybe 15, the center has changed very, very dramatically, as you saw here in these pictures. And not only that, the new government has really sort of accelerated the mallization of Istanbul. And I see people nodding because you know what I'm talking about. It's a bit like what's happened to New York City under Bloomberg. You look at an old skyline where you used to see minarets, and all of a sudden there's sort of a random skyscraper, which is what happens now when we look at Central Park, or when we even look at this neighborhood. And as there's been sort of more and more new construction, I think many people in Istanbul have become feeling alienated from the space. And angry in a way about the rewriting of history that's going on. And I think part of the tension over Gezi was also about that as well. So those are my sort of initial thoughts and reminiscences, and I hope I managed to connect a little bit of Occupy with what's been happening in Turkey. And I think you're next, is that right? Thank you very much.
Ground my remarks sort of in what we do with the magazine as a platform, so it's nice to kind of have it. And then So I'm gonna take us. Oh, it's on? Okay. All right. So I'm going to take us through a couple of different stages of Occupy in New York. But I wanted to start out just by thanking everyone for the invitation and the opportunity to be in dialogue with folks both in the design and architecture fields, but also comrades and friends from around the world and from Turkey in particular. I just wanted to say just immediate reactions to the film, just randomly some things that really stuck out to me. The forums are a life university was a really beautiful phrase, I thought. The question of learning and living has really been essential, I think, for a lot of people's experience in these movements. Also, Gezi was a milestone in our lives, almost a kind of an event from which there's no really going back, there's no returning to what was, almost in a sort of Alain Badiou type of way. The importance of intergenerational relationships, the fact that you have the children and the elders and the people from various ages participating in these park forums. And then this relationship between media and embodiment. And that's really one of the key sort of structural couples, I think, that is necessary for thinking about politics today, but particularly these movements. Okay, so a couple of the things that I want to flag here are, and I'll list a couple of more of these couples, right? One would be media and embodiment. Another would be space and time. Another would be event and infrastructure. And another would be assembly and commons as well. Okay, and I'll elaborate those a little bit. Also coming from the film, I was really interested to see this concept of the Park Forum, and I'd love to learn more about that, because that's very much where we're at in New York as well, the aftermath, right? The fact that there's been an event, there's been a rupture, a new space has opened, but we're not at the height of the intensity of the mass mobilizations, right? And so what's that atmosphere and that experience like? Those are a couple of the questions I want to raise. I also wanted to just acknowledge, in terms of this dialogue between Taskim and Zuccotti, a very nice exhibition that was just at Pratt that was about the right to the city in those two spaces. And there's a little shot from it with some documentary footage from Turkey, and then a lot of kind of pieces of the infrastructure from our own camp here that had been transformed into kind of a precarious piece of architecture. And one image from Taskim that was especially lovely were if you can see on the right hand, these hands that are planting a little seed, right? And that metaphor of sowing seeds and growing, right? That it's not only about a negation or a protest, but it's about cultivating both new social relationships as well as new ways of reproducing life at a very material level. Okay. I also just wanted to flag, was anybody here at these events over the summer in Zuccotti? Really beautiful, just like as unexpected as the events in Turkey, where suddenly there are big assemblies, general assemblies, mic checks in Turkish happening in Zuccotti Park last summer. And so that was a beautiful moment of solidarity there. And one thing that it really brought to head was that it showed that Occupy is not a noun. It's not a thing like some organization or something like that in the United States. It's a verb, right? It's a metaphor, it's a trope, it's a thing that circulates globally, it's a thing that can be attached to different sites and different spaces and struggles, and that it opens up a similar kind of imagination. Now I know Occupy is only one strand of language used in Gezi, obviously, so I don't want to fetishize it, but still it struck a chord for us here. And it also suggests the extent to which Occupy Wall Street itself, obviously, and I think was alluded to in the remarks a moment ago, has global origins itself. And so if you look back at one of the first Occupy Wall Street memes, says, "Are you ready for a Tahrir moment?" on September 17th. Flood into Lower Manhattan, set up tents, kitchens, peaceful barricades, and Occupy Wall Street, right? So it's kind of a passing of the baton of this trope, right? Whether you use the word occupy or not, the tactic and the verb and the spirit is something that opens a kind of global imaginary. Okay, now these are just a couple of images. I can't ground them precisely in the narrative. I don't know enough about Turkey, and so I'm excited to learn more. But another thing, the setting, not just of big protests, but the setting up of a self-organized infrastructure of kitchens, of libraries, of sleeping spaces, of music, and of course of democratic assembly, right? That was also something that really resonated with us. And so there's the kind of people's library there, although a little bit more militant maybe in Turkey, right? So you could say that's a book block. So you put books on those blocks, but you probably end up using those blocks to toss them at the police as well, which wasn't, maybe in Oakland that happened a bit in the United States, but not really in New York City. Also the fact though that in Taksim, it seems it was very much, it started, and I know it grew to whole new proportions and new levels, it seemed like it started around a question of territorial defense of a very specific space, right? Now with Zuccotti Park, nobody cared about Zuccotti Park at all. It was sheerly a tactical decision to implant ourselves there to set up a base camp and a media event, right? There was no particular attachment to the history of Zuccotti or even the practices of like public space in Zuccotti. It's basically just a kind of a corporate concession by land developers. So I was struck by this image from Turkey, right? What if they tried to demolish Central Park, Hyde Park, or Tiergarten to build a mall? That's what's happening here. Right? I know the conflict escalated far beyond just the holding and defending of the space, but still that's one difference I would say. Now, also the question, as was noted, right? The importance of physical space, but what happens when you don't have physical space? Or what happens when you don't have a finite location you can return to over and over again that's secure, that's sustainable? That's really been our conundrum here. And so in the next couple of images I want to show, think about the different kinds of spatial practices and tactics that we've had to use. Okay, so now real quick, so Tidal, we've had 4 issues of Tidal. It's called Occupy Theory, Occupy Strategy. Some of the principles of it were that it was really important to us to produce media that was grounded in the voices of people in the park and doing the organizing. There's a proliferation of external commentary, some of it good, some of it not, but ultimately, right, not grounded in the experience of what was taking place. So that was one important point, was that this would be a self-organized media platform. We also, another thing that we did was to anchor, to mix up voices from people in the park with very prominent intellectuals, right? Both as a way of leveraging cultural capital, also as a way of building critical connections, and also challenging intellectuals who are prominent for thinking about radical politics and theory to really kind of go beyond their limits, both in terms of thought, but as well as the way they address an audience, right? So in Tidal, whether it be Gayatri Spivak or Judith Butler or Silvia Federici, we always ask them, please just write like 700 words, right? Take up that challenge instead of giving us an academic essay, right? So that's always been an interesting dynamic. Also, we wanted something that was a hard copy, something that has a kind of tangibility and physicality. That's related again to this thing of between media and embodiment. We also wanted it to be visual. We wanted it to be able to communicate in ways that was not just, oh, we're gonna read some theory, right? So here's a picture when Tidal invited Judith Butler to Zuccotti Park. And then, so you would have an essay by Butler alongside, say, diagrams of spatial strategies in the park, which is what you see there. Let's see. All right. So now it was actually not released until, and this is the back, this is where the meme of tenting first started. And people were already setting up tents all over the place, but the idea of it as a replicable meme came from Tidal. Now, Tidal actually came out just after, the first one came out just after the eviction of the park. And so it emerged out of the sort of excitement and the energy of the park, but also at this moment of crisis where we didn't have physical space anymore, right? Whereas this traumatic eviction, the danger of losing the momentum that we had with the narrative of the 99%, all that stuff. And so emerging out of the eviction, there were basically 2 spatial tactics that were developed. The first one is what would give birth to what is still going on now, Occupy Homes. And this was the only one of these that really took place in New York City on December 6th, in which, in collaboration with community groups and local legislators actually in the East New York, Occupy took over a bank-owned property, a foreclosed bank-owned property that was vacant, and rehoused an unhoused family and used it as kind of a media event. Now, it backfired a little bit in terms of the logistics, and that we can talk about that later. It set up a replicable tactic, though, that continues all over the country. So in Minneapolis now, you have eviction-free zones, right, where people are being defended from eviction, but also taking over vacant properties and using them for social reproduction. The other this is very close. This is about a couple blocks down from where we are right now. The attempt to take Duarte Square, which is controlled by the Lower Manhattan Cultural Council and owned by Trinity Church. Trinity Church being the largest landholder in New York City, that goes back to the origins of colonial New York. Okay? Now, Trinity had expressed its solidarity with Occupy Wall Street, but when we asked and petitioned to take that space that was empty, it was just being used as kind of like it was an empty public space in the very traditional model of public space. We said we want this to be the new base camp. It'll be a model occupation since the eviction happened. The church did not accept the petition, and so it was taken by force, or it was attempted to be. You can see people took the ladders, threw them over the fence, and jumped over, and subsequently many people were arrested, and that was the last aggressive spatial act that Occupy has really done in New York City. We used that on the cover of Title II. There's a picture you can see of the 99% about to break down this. The fence almost came down. If it had, it would have totally changed the game, right? So it's just these two cops trying to hold the fence. So now we don't have any space. We have the tactic of the Occupy homes that's developing around the country, but in New York City there's no space, right? So you have a diaspora, the Occupy diaspora. People are living in communes and squats and churches, and so how do you sustain and bring that community back together that had started to develop so much momentum? It ended up being that during the spring of 2012, there was a narrative of spring awakening and spring regeneration, all leading to May Day. And as people know, May Day is a holiday in the United States that's suppressed. That's why we have Labor Day instead of May Day. And so this was a historic attempt to inject May Day with a kind of radical anti-capitalist politics in alliance with unions and immigrant justice groups. So we had a huge, amazing march, basically is all it turned it out to be. There wasn't a lot of good tactical thinking about what to do at the end in terms of making a bigger event. A lot of energy went into it, but the key thing, like in the park, it's all about developing the relationships. That's the key thing, right? It's not even about protesting or prefiguring the society you want to have. It's about concretely developing the relationships that can get reactivated and developed in the future. So in Tidal, give me a couple more minutes here. Okay, so May Day didn't work, right? It was a big thing, a lot of learning process, a lot of connections developing. It wasn't like a Brooklyn Bridge, right? It wasn't a Zuccotti. So we took it back to basics after May Day, right? We saw that the New York City labor movement, even though there are radical tendencies in it, it's not going to be something that's going to produce any major rupture, right? Even though grassroots workers and rank and file often are very radical and assertive, right? There remains very top-down organizing, and labor is not going to be like the subject of history in New York City, let's say. So we took it right back to basics, and we started almost like the park forums in Gezi. Very small, chill, mellow meetings in public space to start talking about building a debt resistance movement. Okay, now debt had been a major issue from the beginning in the grievances, whether it be credit card debt, student debt, medical debt, obviously mortgages. And so that's when we started to develop the group Strike Debt. And so Tidal, we launched Strike Debt in Title III over the summer of 2012. Let's see, here, so and that issue was called Year 2. The previous one was called Spring is Coming. This was Year 2. So over the summer, the debt assemblies really gained a lot of traction. And again, it's this very low-tech thing of just having conversations and talking about your debt, right? Breaking out of that shame and isolation and building a kind of imaginary around debtors, right? How could debtors act politically together? As it developed, one of the tactics was the debt burn. So you get together and assemble and burn your bills. And this is something that we prefigured on the back of Tidal with this iconic image of this invisible army of defaulters doing their. The second big push in Strike Debt, now we're into the fall, was the release of the Debt Resisters Operations Manual that'll be coming out in the second edition soon, and then something called the Rolling Jubilee, where we purchase large amounts of toxic defaulted medical debt and then cancel them as a kind of jubilee in the tradition of biblical wiping of the slates. Okay, and that was launched with, speaking of how to leverage different kinds of spaces, it was launched in a real productive collaboration with the artistic and musical fields, and so we had a fundraiser at La Poisson Rouge right down the street here. Now, right when we're doing Rolling Jubilee, everybody's excited, it's beautiful, it touches a nerve, it's a big deal. right? We get climate strike, right? The climate crisis of Wall Street comes home to roost. And then you have the financial district underwater, but of course the people who are most impacted are the most marginal and vulnerable already in the city. So this now, based on the connections though, from Mayday, from the park, from all these other things, the infrastructure of Occupy Sandy gets activated very quickly, right? And so here you have the repurposing of churches primarily around the city as a sort of life support network that's self-organized, that has to step into the void of the state when Bloomberg and the Red Cross are basically negligent of the most marginal areas. So this is 521 Clinton. Okay, and then so that led us to think something Occupy hadn't done was really think at the scale of the city, right? We had really focused a lot on holding a block, holding a park, then doing these kind of distributed network of assemblies, and then really Occupy Sandy was the first time people were really working on the ground intensively in these different disaster sites. And so we felt we had a lot to learn, and so we went to Detroit. And there's a piece in the new title here that's called Learning from Detroit, and it's an allusion to learning from Las Vegas, right, like Venturi. Except here we were going to meet with people who've been doing anti-capitalist organizing there for generations, okay? And so now Detroit is known, right, for its crisis, for its hopelessness, supposedly in the mainstream media. Now we have the emergency management regime. It's also the place that has some of the most radical experiments in anti-capitalist life going on. And so this is just down in the corner, that's some folks from the Detroit Black Community Food Security Network, who are part of a very intensive network there of people working on food justice and particularly non-capitalist land use. And so I'll finish there just by saying on the 29th, some people who've been working on these similar questions, my friend Christina here, who's also a site coordinator for Occupy Sandy, will be leading a discussion about the model of a community land trust, which is a way of decommodifying land, taking it out of the speculative market, and creating a commons. And so now, where are we at now? A big question for us is commoning, right? The idea that commons isn't just there and you grab it, right? It's not just a resource sitting there. You have to build it through struggle and through through experimentation. And so we're having every Monday at 16 Beaver Space, we're having something called commoning courses, where we're both reading a lot of theory about commons, but also learning concretely from people working on the ground in food shares, in workers' co-ops, working on alternative land use and that kind of thing. So ultimately, right, all roads lead to Wall Street and all roads lead to Detroit. That's kind of our story, and land is the central piece there. But again, we don't have land, we don't have space right now, so we're still working in this network manner. So platforms like this in the art world and in the academia are really essential, and so that's another reason I'm really grateful for you hosting us tonight. So I apologize I went on a little bit long, but thanks for listening.
I think there's... Hello? But I need this. Yes. Oh, you need this. Sure. Okay. Good evening, everyone. I am Hayrettin. I'm coming from Boston, but I am originally from Istanbul. I'm so excited, and I'm a terrible public speaker, so I'll try to read most of the time, but try to make eye contact once in a while. So the presentation I prepared today is more of a personal one, in which I tried to share my experiences around the Gezi events. I tried to raise some questions that have been bugging me since for a long time, and I'm hoping to leave this room with more. Okay. So I structured my talk chronologically, starting from the announcement of the project in July 2011. But this won't be an examination of the whole process, Gezi process. I will highlight some projects that we undertook as Architecture for All, which is Herkes, İçin, Mimarlık in Turkish. And beginning from the announcement, I will try to show some examples. So the first question that I raised is, how do you start a conversation? So Okay, Herkes için Mimarlık. As optimistic young architects, my friends and I founded Architecture for All in order to build a multidisciplinary platform that reimagines the structure and the scope of architectural processes. We started by working on self-initiated community development projects in which we created connections between local communities, public institutions, and private sector companies. You can see from these examples, from building fishermen shelters to building housing for teachers in rural Turkey. But when Taksim project was announced, we were still in our foundation process. But this project was epiphany for our organization. The reason for that is, apart from projects in practical design, we found this project incredibly alarming that the citizens who would be affected by this project were not made of the decision-making process. So what we needed was a conversation not only including city officials and architects, but also people who use Gezi Park. In addition, we had to reach out to the people who have never used the park before, but present them that they have right to that place. By the time we want to take action against this project, other groups had already been protesting by, we can say, conventional methods. This could be like holding posters, making press statements, preparing balloons, and forming human chains. But we wanted to try something different. First, we organized a workshop in which we discussed government claims that Gezi Park do not serve as a public space. But these workshops gave birth to our first project, which is called Gezi Park Festivals. No, probably you have to start, yeah. It's just a short clip from the festivals. Yeah.
Flip from that.
Yeah. Okay, so Gezi Park Festival was an idea that we come up with from this workshop that we did. With this, what we tried to do was that showing that the unpopular Gezi Park could become a lively public space with just small interventions. We publicized the events through social media channels, invited musicians, dancers, and performance artists, and organized workshops as well as games that would attract people. So this is from the first festival that we did. It was like maybe 50 people there. But by the fifth festival that we did, we reached around 500 people maybe. So in this time span of 2 years, we did 10 festivals and attracted people who never used the park before. And what we thought was the most powerful way to claim ownership on this space was actually being there. So, but however, in terms of starting a conversation, this festivals were not successful. We couldn't catch the media's attention. So there's some other. So we tried something else. So while we were trying to show people that Gezi Park could be used, we made an open call for visuals in any media in response to the following questions. What does Taksim mean to you? What kind of a Taksim Square do you dream about? What do you think about the proposed project? how can we achieve a transparent and participatory process for Taksim project? This was named Taksim için sana soran oldu mu? Which can be translated as who asked you. And interestingly, in English as well, it has that same second meaning. We intentionally choose that thing. These are some of the visuals that was proposed by some people for this open call. And I translated, but it's really small. This one is saying, no one asked me. This one is saying, did we ask? This one is saying, I did it, and it's over. And as a part of this project, Who Asked You, we also interviewed the regulars of Gezi Park about the project, and they asked them their opinions about the future of the square.
Yarın zelzel olursa ne yapacağız? Her yer bina oldu zaten.
This is a demonstration of flip format.
Sorry for that. This is just a small clip. We talk with many people, and these are on our websites, and you can, if you're interested, you can check them out. But what I want to say is this interview showed one thing clearly. People were desperately in need of open spaces. However, they were hesitant to voice their opinion when a big urban project like this was put on the table. They rather preferred to let the government or professionals decide on their behalf. And in order to bring the public's hidden unrest to the surface, maybe we needed a different approach, because so far our attempts hadn't mobilized as many people as we wanted. So we did another thing. This is a side project. It's a series of posters in which we illustrated the negative outcomes of the planned project in very straightforward way. This one is saying people will lose their businesses, or the traffic congestion will continue, or interestingly, the trees will be cut. So, and this was an open source thing, and we gave the links, published it on our website, so people could print them and hang them wherever they want. But interestingly, these posters may be the closest point that we came in terms of starting a conversation. So when we posted these posters on Facebook, people start making comments on them, either criticizing it or praising the project. It wasn't maybe a progressive discussion, but still people were saying something about the project. But we were really disappointed because we couldn't get any response from the government. And this finally led us to create a conversation that actually never existed. So for this project that we did for Design Biennial, we envisioned a parallel universe where the current conditions of the project were handled through different perceptions, different policies, strategies, and different foresights. In this ideal world, the political power were acting only for the benefits of the public, without any agenda, political agenda or ideology. And to illustrate this, through a television program, a newspaper, and the fax machine, we received news from this parallel world. So this was like a newspaper that we created for that thing called Parallel, where Prime Minister was saying there was no intention of building something on top of Gezi Park, or if there was, you should talk with the municipal president, because this is none of my business. And so this is this is a clip taken from an interview with a fake guy from a municipality who was in charge of the Taksim project in a parallel world. And well, actually these are members of our organization. and the guy is talking about the project.
Çevresinin İstanbul için ne kadar önemli bir yer olduğunu hepimiz biliyoruz. İşte bakın insanlar hafta sonları buraya gelip beraber vakit geçiriyorlar. Önemli bir yer. İstanbul'da yaşayan neredeyse herkesin hafızasında ve yaşantısına yer alan, sadece bugünüyle değil, geçmişiyle de önemli bir yer burası. Geçtiğimiz 10 yıla da baktığımızda dönüşüm hareketi epey ivme kazanmış vaziyette. İstanbul büyümeye ve
So when I was preparing this presentation and I took look back to the things that we have done, most of these attempts could be considered naive. There was a constant struggle between being idealistic and being realistic. But I can say that despite the constant disappointment, we have learned to swim in that dangerous waters. And actually, we had jumped into it without knowing how to swim. So, but unfortunately, 2 or 3 months before the protest, we had lost our optimism, and we were thinking, unless a miracle happened, we lost this fight. I want to share this mail with you that I received from Taksim platform on the evening of 27th of May. And I think this was like, for me, this was like the beginning of everything. This guy from this bigger group called Taksim Platform, which is a bigger network of activists dealing with this project, was just going back to his apartment, and while going through the park, he noticed there was an activity with this excavators in the park. So he mails to the platform saying that there are these people started working in the park, and we have to do something. We have to stop it in the morning. Let's come together and start doing something. And that's how it started. On the next day, 50 people started the first occupiing, and the police intervened, and I guess all of you know the rest of the story, and I won't go into the detail. I'm missing a slide here, actually, but the question for this part that I want to raise is, what happens when the public says no? So, for me, the protest was a life-changing event. Putting the tragic deaths of young people aside, with respect, the protest had a magical aspect with it. It wasn't only because of its unexpected nature, but also because of its ability to make me question the fundamental things of my life, like architecture. So now I would like to talk about the project that we did during the protest. It's called Occupy Gezi Architecture. So when we were in the park, when the police retreated from the park, even though the protest overflew the physical borders of the park in few days, the small city of Gezi was the most interesting aspect of the protest for me, which I wanted to explore from an architectural point of view. So, as soon as we were in the park, we wanted to do something. As architects, we wanted to use our design skills, let's say, to help the community there. But there was one thing that we noticed, we really realized, that people in the park were already creating their beds, their libraries, their kitchens, without needing us, without needing so-called expertise of design. So this clever makeshift quality of these creations fascinated us and gave birth to our project Occupy Gezi. These are some examples of these structures. You can see some drawings from this side. So what we did was creating a crowdsourced database of drawings of these makeshift designs. We used drawing as a tool to understand what people were doing there. Actually, in architecture, what we are doing is first drawing it, designing it, and then building it. In this case, this process was upside down. The things were already built, but we used drawing as an experiment to understand what was already been built. So I brought some examples here. One could say that these drawings are abstract and sterile, but when everyone, like who was drawing these drawings, was filtering these images through their own filters and leaving some details out or emphasizing some stuff. In this case, the person who drew this, for example, wrote the slogan on the metal scrap there, saying "Diren Dobla," which I found really interesting because the slogan was the resistance there, and the resistance became architecture, and you couldn't leave out the slogan there. So, yeah, this is. Going back to the first question after Gezi, we are again with the same question: how do you start the conversation? Sleeping in the park, living there, and feeling the atmosphere showed me that we were really good at transforming a space in a short period of time. We raised our voice against the monopoly over the decisions made for our city. Nevertheless, the political power will always try to disconnect us from the physical spaces of resistance. So how do we move on? I think the specific challenge in Turkey is the majority of my generation was not involved with politics before. The ruling party officials are insisting on, if we are not satisfied with the current conditions, we should vote for the opposition in next elections. But there's a strong dissatisfaction with that, including me. The satisfaction with these existing institutions and parties. Recently I was watching Michael Hart's interview about Gezi protests, and he was saying that these ruptures opened up by these movements are not enough to transform societies. We need to search for a new kind of democracy that will be long-lasting and socially widespread. For this reason, I think the question, how do you start a conversation, becomes important again. And this is being discussed in the forums taking part in Istanbul. They're also discussing this issue, and I wrote some questions from the forums. They're asking how to spread the word of resistance to more conservative neighborhoods that did not support the uprising, and which were provoked by the government to oppose the protests. Is it a good idea to invite other religious or conservative groups to the forums? And how to form a dialogue with these communities if they show up? To conclude with, I know I talk a lot, it's really hard for me to say if my generation can come up with these new ways of democracy. But after I'm thinking about all of these disappointments that I tried to show you and that we went through in these 2 years, this protest taught me that if there's one thing that this protest taught me is the possibility of a miracle. So I will cut it there, and thank you for listening.
Hi, I'm Greta Hansen. I'm part of Common Practice alongside Adam Koogler, who you probably met at the door, and Kyung-Jae Kim. And we're just going to do a really short presentation to give a little bit of an explanation why you went through a bubble today. And I want to thank you all for zipping yourselves into it and out of it to get here to this space. And you'll have to go through it again on your way out, but feel free to hang out there as well. So we formed Common Practice in, should I have a, actually I got to do a test with this thing. Can you hold it down? Oh, you can, okay, perfect. Can you go backwards? So we formed Common Practice in 2011 at the Occupy movement. We were 3 architects who met in school, and we too wanted to do something for the movement, with our skills, and we decided that the way to do that would be to make the cheapest and easiest thing we could think of. So we did something which a lot of people are already doing. And Adam might come up too, actually. This is Adam, who you met at the door. And actually, Adam, if you sit over there, you can probably like help me. Okay. Because I got to go through like a animation that's not an animation. We'll figure it out. Anyway, so yeah, we started making pallets, which people were already using because the ground was sloped at Zuccotti Park, but we just put stacks of cardboard, and then we put plastic over that and screwed it all together, and it became an insulated support for your tent. And then we intended to distribute a lot of them, but didn't make it because of the eviction. We did another thing very similar. We made a medical triage station. If you guys remember, there was a fairly large medical area down at Zuccotti, and this was a little pop-up pavilion where people who were sort of manning that site could sit in the winter, and it was covered with bubble wrap, and it cost about $25 to make, and it was pretty simple, and it was sitting on one of those insulated pallets.
And I think it's important for us to note that in any of these projects, we weren't distributing ready-mades to people. I don't think I need to.
Really?
I'm projecting fine, right? So we weren't actually distributing a product or a made artifact to people. We didn't want any sort of top-down involvement in the Occupy movement. We really focused on sets of instructions and graphics as our means of contributing.
But one thing that we did want, and this relates to what we brought here today, was we just wanted to build an enormous bubble. And it's so easy to make bubbles. We made this one out of duct tape. We did it in a day. And it was harder, a little bit harder before, but our goal was to make a huge bubble that would cover Zuccotti, and it would be inflated with foot pumps by hundreds of people at the perimeter of the bubble. And if you can see this really very simple animation, does it work? Yes, it works. There we go. Like that, right?
So the aspect of the Occupy Zuccotti that interested us the most was the General Assembly, and when it was in session, it was sort of confusing, and we felt like perhaps there was a visual cue, sort of literal occupation of the space that could happen in tandem with the congregation of the people.
Oh, right, and sort of the size of it is the length that a human voice can travel without a microphone in a crowded city, which we think is about 250 feet. So this would have been a very big bubble. So in the meantime, we actually started to make some smaller bubbles. A very small bubble made with foot pumps that children can inflate.
This was actually really popular at the park in Chinatown, and the kids just sort of took it over, and it turns out that all those instructions that we were preoccupied with were sort of completely unnecessary.
And this is a bicycle blower that we made over the summer. We welded together some pieces with an exhaust fan, and the fan engages with the back tire so that when the bike is up on stays, it inflates your inflatable. It also makes an incredibly amazing portable device.
So this inflates, well, when Greta rides it, it's about 8 minutes. When I ride it, it's about 2 minutes. But the interest here is obviously not relying on a grid, not relying on an outlet. Although tonight we're relying on a Lasco box fan. That's typically not what we intend to do. This just happens to be fairly loud to have in an interior space.
And so here's another picture of that zipper door that you went through. And we thought, since we originally wanted to make the inflatable General Assembly, the inflatable that would cover the entire General Assembly, we would make the first part of it today, and that's what we've brought. And so the doors have Velcro on them, and conceivably you might hook your own up next to ours. and here's the instructions which are in the bubble for how to do it, and perhaps we could actually get an inflatable General Assembly in the end.
Thank you, everyone. I'd like to introduce Selva Gerdowen to lead the Q&A.
Hello. I'll also a little bit introduce myself further. We have been given the wonderful task of leading the Studio X Istanbul starting in November. I'm an architect. I have been working in Istanbul since 2006, and before that I used to live in New York, so I know a little bit both contexts, and hopefully we can have a very productive conversation tonight. And thank you so much for all the presentations. It's really, really amazing to have you all here. I have one kind of observation that I would like to ask your opinion about. One is that also a little bit about my own experience of the Gezi Park events. I think we're not as young as Hayrettin in many ways, and me and my partner Gregor, he's also in the audience tonight. So even though we were very much involved with the Gezi Park protests, we were not so much in the actual space. We were kind of more on social media, and actually in many sort of strange diplomatic conversations between the municipality as well. So we were living that 2-3 weeks very intensely. So there's quite a lot of involvement for me with the Gezi Park. But then again, kind of looking at it from a distance now, and I'm very curious that even though it had a sense of unity on the park, it actually created a very massive polarity as well. And I find that really interesting that it happened in Cairo, I think in the same manner, and it also happened in Turkey in the same manner. It's a question to the sort of the New York sort of activism here, that it actually didn't produce that polarity, I imagine. Not at that same massive scale that it did in Istanbul and in Cairo, and I was just wondering what your observations are on that.
Could you say a bit more about how you understand the polarity?
Do you mean between, yeah, that's a good question. Are you talking a little bit about the religious and the secular, the Kemalists, and...
I think that's oversimplification to put it as a religious and secular, but actually I think it's not like that, but because I think both circles are quite homogeneous, like the pro-Gezi and the against Gezi are both, they're very heterogeneous also, like there's not one type of religious person and there's not one type of secular person, and I think there was a lot of mixing between in the two ends, but at the end of the day there was a very strong pro and there was a very strong against, and I don't think there was a very strong against Occupy in New York, and I'm very curious why our geography produced that, or like why it didn't happen in New York. Was it just because it was actually much smaller? And it didn't really matter that much, that it mattered more in Turkey? I'm really curious.
That's a really good question. Well, I think there were a lot of different factors at play. I think that in some ways we have maybe less polarization and maybe more polarization. I mean, I think that part of what Occupy did was they chose a target that everybody really hates, which is finance. So in that sense, I think that's something that pretty much everyone can agree on, except for people maybe who are working in that sector. And I think also part of what happened was the slogans of things like the 1% so quickly became adopted by everybody that in that sense I think there was a lot of agreement about finance. Now, as we know, the problem was that didn't necessarily translate into a lot of concrete political action, and the legislative response that we should have had in Washington got very watered down. It's certainly, as you say, as you point out, didn't mean that debt and foreclosures and all those problems were solved. But I think in terms of the sort of the rhetoric of finance and how it created the crisis, I think was something that was easy for people to get their heads around. But certainly there were lots of people that didn't support the Occupy Wall Street. I just don't happen to know any of those people.
Yeah, so I mean that's a nice point, is that the 99%, right? It forces everyone to do you want to identify with the banksters or do you want to identify with everybody else? So it's kind of like a third estate kind of thing in the French Revolution in that respect, right? The tiny minority is the enemy of the people, and we are the ones who've borne the brunt, and we will be the people that will resist. And it was also nice because it wasn't ideologically defined, even though I think everyone who's involved with it, the core organizers and thinkers and organizers, certainly are anti-capitalist and largely anarchist, although there's a spectrum. But the 99% totally overrode that question of ideology because the financial crisis was so impactful in the lives of the great majority that all you just had to touch that nerve of anger and grievance, and it opened up this space. In the new title that I passed around, we commissioned an essay from Chantal Mouffe called "The Fault Lines of the 99%." And there was not a polarization in the sense of an almost kind of civil war scenario. So it's not a matter of polarization of some people defending or against Occupy. It's more internal to the 99%, right? Who is the 99%? What are the power relations within that figure, right? It's so general that it's hugely welcoming and inclusive, and yet it also has the problem, in some cases, say, of not acknowledging and working through issues of particularly the histories of racial inequality, and similarly gender inequality. That's something we tried to grapple with on May Day because we were working very closely with immigrant justice folks, like many of whom are undocumented. So our undocumented part of the 99%, and our coalition said yes, of course, right? So that would be, I would just make that note. The other thing too is that part of why the 99% resonated is because the financial crisis, what Gayatri Spivak described as the demotion of the white middle class to economic conditions that had historically been experienced by communities of color in foreclosure, in debt, in precariousness, right? So the 99% comes out of that crisis of the American dream that mostly middle-class white people had typically counted on, right? A job, a house, a family, healthcare, et cetera. So it's not exactly polarization, because I think the point about like the 1% 99 was brilliant, right? But it's inside the 99%. That's where the real difficult politics has been. And again, questions of racial inequality and justice are at the absolute heart of it, just as they're at the heart of the history of the United States as well. So.
I don't like this kind of generalizations, but I will do it. I think what happened in Turkey was, as Turkish people, we tend to keep quiet. Even very bad things happen to us. We just try to solve it inside ourselves and not to raise our voice because of many reasons that you may be familiar or not. But in this case, there was something peculiar happen. So people found this hole in this thing, and where they could get rid of this burden that maybe they were carrying for a long time. This burden could be with many, for many reasons, but people just found that space to just get rid of it, go there and talk about it, shout it, and just be relaxed. So that could be a reason for that diversity, I think.
But now learning from New York in that sense, it would be quite an interesting conversation to have either back in Istanbul or now, like what would be the 99% for Turkey, because it also desperately needs a goal when everyone can feel kind of good about. I think that's, for me, like I would really be interested to hear your thoughts, Hayrettin, on that. But you know, maybe today or maybe later. Okay, we'll save that for later. It's a long discussion, but it's really curious to me to look at both the situation in Cairo and in Istanbul, and kind of it's yeah.
I have a question for you. I mean, to bring it back to economics, isn't there a feeling in Turkey that things are actually getting better, right? GDP is growing 8% a year. Youth unemployment is only 16%, which is high, but compared to Greece and Spain, where it's 50 and 60%. So my sense when I go back to Istanbul is that actually, in many ways, Turkey is in a good space, right? There's a lot of economic development, there's a lot of growth. Whereas in Egypt, people are really, really desperate. And since the revolution, things have only gotten worse. So I wonder if that's also part of the polarization too, that feeling of desperation.
Could be. I mean, so in some ways, it's a little bit weird, but we do expect a financial crisis. We don't know when, but I mean, when you look at sort of the numbers of how much the construction sector is taking up in the overall economy of Turkey, it's the same as what it was for Spain before the Spanish crisis. So, but it is also sort of a little bit strange to imagine that you need a crisis for the 99% to come together, and I find that as a kind of a problematic thing to kind of for our future, like that you need a crisis to become optimistic. So that's again a question back to you, I think.
Yeah, you know, at the maybe this might be easier. Sorry, excuse me. This might be. You okay? Okay, sure. Well, you know, you had referred to Michael Hart, who's been a great friend of the movement and actually has a piece in the new Tidal. He, at the end of their declaration, which is their sort of post-2011 book, he has this thing about the tension between the crisis and the event, right? Because we know there's more coming, financial crises, ecological crises, crises of police violence. But coming out of these movements and these ruptures, right, how do you start to build an infrastructure? Because you can never plan the world, okay? But you can build an infrastructure that prepares a collectivity to be able to spring into action, which is what happened with Occupy Sandy. And so that's one thing in these moments where the intensity goes down, right? What's that work like? Strengthening those connections, even if you don't have a space, right? I think these park forums are really interesting. And then back to this question, you had mentioned one project that people are thinking about is having these conversations and dialogues in the more conservative neighborhoods. And I was interested in that point, because here, one of the things too that really flipped the switch was, I mean, the financial crisis and the fact that so many people, working class people, are already fucked anyways, right? But you remember the instances of police violence here, right? Those were like the triggers for big outpourings of grievance and anger and disgust at the Bloomberg, and then NYPD comes to be seen as the guardians of the 1%. Again, that's a new experience for white people, right? And so it's tricky because those images of the white women getting pepper sprayed by Union Square, that was huge. That was hugely galvanizing. We know that happens to people of color all the time, right? And it doesn't have the same traction. But like my mom saw, and I'm a white male, right? My mom saw the video of those girls getting pepper sprayed, and she's like, oh my God, Bloomberg, like fuck Bloomberg, Wall Street defender, da, da. There's something about it sets into motion this imagination where like regular old, well, I don't want to say regular, but like, let's say the dominant like white middle class, right, groups suddenly start to get not radicalized, but their imaginations open up and they start to see these points of deeper violence in the system economically with police, et cetera. And so, to go back to Turkey, it seems like, I mean, I've seen some footage and I don't know the precise stories, but of everyday people, shop owners and grandmas and little kids, and the thing of the little children singing the song about the police batons and the helmets and saying, we're not afraid, right? There's something there, like at the level of affect and subjectivity, that kind of crazy subjective transformation you were describing. That I wonder if in Turkey those confrontations with the police, in some cases, opened up people's they're like, how dare this state that claims to represent us brutalizing our friends, families, and communities in this way. So anyway, so I'm sorry for that ramble, but the point is your point about the conservative neighborhoods, because it maybe speaks to the polarization issue, if I'm reading that correctly, or I don't know.
In terms of police brutality, I think in Istanbul as well, that was the turning point of the things. Like, I show you that mail, and that was making a call for an Occupy thing, and that day 50 people were there, but if the police didn't intervene so brutally, then this wouldn't, maybe this protest wouldn't be this as intense as this. So I think, and you were asking what was like 99% for Turkish people. It's really hard to come up with one, but in this case, what united people was this hatred against that police brutality.
But there also was somehow, I mean, I will be the devil's advocate tonight, but there was also the hypocrisy of the situation in some ways. I mean, I'm using a quite heavy word, but the violence in the East was going on for 30 years, right? So it was a similar moment in Istanbul also, like for the first time, what we call the normal or the regular Turkish person saw what was happening for 30 years in Diyarbakır. And for that matter, I think for me, these are the more important things that I take out of Gezi Park protests, that maybe we are the 1% in some way. But let's open it up, maybe.
Yeah. I'm laughing at the mention of Diyarbakır because I was arrested there about 25 years ago.
Congratulations. Yeah. No torture, I hope. Okay, but there's a question in the back.
Yeah, hi. This is a question for common practice. I really love your bubbles. I'm listening to you talk, and I'm looking over here at the colors catalog, and I'm thinking about 40 years ago when inflatables were an exciting thing in architecture and in protests, and I'm wondering how you guys think about your work in relation to the work from an earlier era.
I have a totally answer that doesn't answer your question at all. So we started by heat sealing these bubbles, and somebody tipped us off to this group called Eclectic Electric, and they do the same kind of bubble, really easy. They duct tape it together, but it's like mere mylar material a lot of the time. And they're about they could be this size, smaller or bigger, and then they throw them in front of the police at protests. And that's not an answer at all, but I think it is a suggestion for how inflatables could be more active, and I don't think we've taken it that far, but do you want to answer Karen's question?
Yeah, I was definitely thinking of Ant Farm and all that stuff, right? Like that interest in that moment where experimental architecture really intersected in a serious way with direct action and social movements, and added this kind of beautiful visibility to it that had a pragmatic part, but as well as this and I think all the design work you guys were doing really intersecting with and learning from what was going on the ground is exciting. I mean, if we had taken Duarte, you could have had all types of crazy architectural stuff going on in there. The ironic thing is it was designed by Dan Dioka from Interborough and those folks. So they're cool architecture friends who designed the thing, and then Trinity wouldn't give the space over. But I mean, I always fantasize what that would have looked like. Architects could have just gone nuts. Incidentally, Occupy still has a bunch of giant military tents that were going to be installed in there. That was the plan. But it would have been a great beautification project. And also, how would the spatial forms of these architectural kind of interfaces change the kind of interaction? You guys were talking about the voice and the timing and how it could focus attention and stuff. I think that's a really cool area of inquiry. And I hope, it would be cool just to go out and take them out and see what people do with them at events and marches and stuff,
But I do think it's the same thing, that 30, 40 years ago it was about, it was a bunch of young people doing what they could afford and had the ability to make. And we want to take it even more, even further, how simple can it be?
Yeah, I think there's a frustration with existing power structures and the finance and like all of that as a young architect, and this idea of waiting for somebody to come and ask you to design this amazing project and give you this huge budget, and it was like, why are we waiting for that? Why don't we just go make something? And here's a situation.
Can I ask a little bit about not attention, but kind of a different approach that maybe design and activism has? So on one hand, you know, architecture design is kind of creating events or making sure that certain events happen or trying to accommodate for certain possibilities. Like, so you make this platform so people can kind of sleep better. You make this situation so that there's a better medical tent, or you know, someone designs a building to do something. So there's an intent that's followed out with a specific action in mind. But on the other hand, I noticed that when you were talking about the pepper spray and shooting women in pepper spray and Union Square and pepper spray and the police response at Gezi Park, both two events were talked about kind of passively as in these things happened and thus there was a large response. But they're not talked about in the we made these things happen and thus this thing happened. And it's kind of a, I understand it's kind of a tricky tactic to talk about discussing engineering, right? When you engineer specific events, that's kind of a design and how you apply it onto protest, where you say, oh, I would wish certain events to happen, so we're going to have this kind of police presence and this kind of arrest. And that's like pretty hotly debated. So I'm wondering how you would discuss, or do you have any ideas on how to incorporate either design thinking into activism, or how that kind of becomes distance as activism or protest become expressions of kind of grassroots, undesigned, kind of natural outpourings of emotion. You know, you see there's this kind of, I guess that's it, like the undesigned natural grassroots outcome versus the designed kind of scenario of the structure. Is there any way to kind of swap the two, or to have kind of different thinking processes involved in when you're designing both the structures and both the kind of communal events?
This is, I guess, most related to the May Day.
Oh, well, May Day unfortunately didn't really involve much about space, sadly enough. It really became just a march, and there was a big assembly at the Veterans Memorial, and it really didn't go the way we had planned, as it were. So this tension between planning and then the fact that when people are on the street and police are going crazy, like you have to be open to the event in some way. In terms of like design, I would turn it over to the designers here, but there is a thing we do talk about, like action logic, like let's design an action. Here's the ideal scenario. Like we did one around the way here where you roll up, it's kind of an architectural thing, you roll up to Bank of America in a moving truck, and then you pull out a bunch of used furniture, and then you put it all in front of the bank, and you're doing like a move-in into the bank, and the police show up, and it's a big media spectacle, and it's nice. So anyway, so there's a thing about designing action logic, but then there's also like there are like maps out there of what Duarte would have looked like. Like here was the plan, like here's what it was going to look like. There would have been a really cool role there was even like, I think like a town planning working group or something. Do you guys know, is it Mitch McEwen? Yeah, so I remember you guys were you were having these discussions, right, about what's this going to look like, if we can sustain Zuccotti or if there's a new space, right? That would have been the interesting dialogue, right, between, let's say, the experts who have this skill, but trying to deprofessionalize it, right, relative to the people who have been sleeping there. And so I think it's a really interesting question. And one thing I want to note, I didn't mention the militant research handbook that's going around. That's sort of like Title V, but we got money from NYU for it, which is also about leveraging resources. We're starting this militant research network that's global. So we have in Spain and Argentina and here, and friends in Greece as well. And it's a place where architects who want to keep, and planners who want to plug deeper into these kind of things, would be great to be in dialogue. So let me know afterwards. The point being, there's going to be more reclaimed spaces. Like it's going to happen, whether it be people taking land, people taking more vacant properties, people buying land and decommodifying it. Like there's going to be a great need for architectural expertise. And so keeping in dialogue with that will be important. So.
I just wanted to add that when we were at Occupy, there was so much design work going on by not designers and designers. We got involved through the town planning initially because there wasn't an official group of architects until later. And even non-designers spend a lot of time working out things that maybe look like they weren't thought out, because there was so much starting from scratch. It felt like we didn't have time to access this body of knowledge. And so when Yates was talking, I just remembered this woman that we were lucky to meet who's done just an interesting study to look at. Her name is Anna Fagenbaum, and she's done a study of the layouts of protest camps throughout history. And it's amazing to look at, to sort of compare how the structural differences were, how they came about and how successful they were, potentially in connection with the way they were laid out.
This conversation reminded me of this discussion we had when we were doing that project with Occupy Gezi Architecture. We started documenting this and started drawing these stuff, and there came a moment that one of us suggested, why don't we start designing some stuff and offering it to, making it an open database that people from other Occupy movements can use it and build their own structures. But we thought this was a dangerous border, let's say, because when you start designing something, you start controlling it, and the power of that structures was of its spontaneous nature, and how its locality, how people use the stuff that was intended for the construction of tunnels they were opposed to, and transforming into structures that they need. So that had a symbolic meaning in itself. So when you start designing, it's we try to stay away from that.
Why don't we talk about your first point of the question about where we see things going, and so do other people want to speak to that? And I'd love to answer the Banksy thing. But you guys want to?
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Maybe wrong. Maybe we should use that mic. Yeah, I think hijacked is a good word. I think those spaces are highly contested. Part of the violence against women in Cairo, in Tahrir Square, was clearly an attempt to make the point that the square didn't belong to protesters. So I think that's a reasonable word. I think in terms of, I don't know if I can comment on public space in New York, but I found it horrifying, and I know so many other people did, that a First Amendment right was suddenly turned into something that Mayor Bloomberg got to decide about. And it suddenly gets reframed as a question of public hygiene, noise, dirt, disruption. And then when you do that, you can just trample on everyone's rights. And I don't know how, I'm sure you're all following the mayoral election. This whole debate about affordable housing in New York City is so unbelievable, because the amounts of affordable housing that they're talking about are so tiny. I think there's something in the paper yesterday that it's 50,000 units is all that's being argued over the last few years. So it's really a squelching of that space too. And obviously public protest spaces are incredibly important, but housing is also, as you point out, as Yates has pointed out, incredibly important. So I mean, I guess that park in Istanbul wasn't even it's not a really great park. It's not the best space.
It's pretty nice.
Yeah, I mean, it's fine, but when you think of all the places in Istanbul, but I think it had an importance that went beyond its physical space. I mean, it wasn't a Central Park or or a Hyde Park, right? It had another kind of meaning, is what I'm trying to say.
But I think that the other park, the park that a lot of this footage comes from, is really beautiful, and it lends itself really easily to this kind of activity. My DP and partner is here, and we talked a lot about this. It doesn't read quite here, but there are a lot of circular spaces, not just in this park, but also in the neighborhood of Beşiktaş, where this park is located. And so they're circles, and people use them as circles, which means everyone sort of sits around, and there's something kind of like naturally and easily beautiful about that. So I sort of agree that Gezi is not that great, but
sorry to cut into, but actually it's really funny because Gezi Park is actually not a park on its own. It's a green belt, very much similar to Central Park, but it has been built over it so many times that what is left over, yes, is maybe not so majestic anymore. But when you look at the map, never mind, we'll not go into it. But it's actually, when you look at the map, it's a quite large area that it could have been connected by pedestrian access, but it's been chopped up by hotel developments and Congress Valley and so forth. So.
No, I agree with you. I mean, because I think the other element of space that we haven't spoken about quite is transportation. And there used to be a huge bus connection right in front of Gezi Park that now has been moved. Nobody really knows where, at least over the summer, people didn't really know where the buses were anymore. Oh, I think it's over here behind that hotel. So I agree with what you're saying, that it's been very chopped up, but it's not that it didn't used to be great, it just wasn't used in the same way that we understand the ideas of Central Park or Hyde Park, but it was certainly a space that was used. I mean, who hasn't changed a bus there or picked up a bus there? To get from anywhere in Istanbul to anywhere else, if you started in Taksim, you had to get on a bus there, so.
I think that there's a real limitation to the concept of public space. And so biographically, my mentor is Rosalind Deutsch, if people know her work at Columbia. And my own thinking about all this comes out of Rosalind, right? And the whole thing is, space isn't just material, it's not just the physical artifact, it's the discursive and the symbolic and the psychological space that gets constructed out of people appearing together in public. And Judith Butler has a really nice iteration of that she wrote about Tahrir and Occupy. So that's crucial. It goes back to Hannah Arendt and Aristotle and whatever. But the thing is that in public space, you have all the particular regulations about assembly, First Amendment. Occupy really blew a lot of those apart, though. Like before Occupy, it was very hard to gather more than like 20 or 30 people together in like Central Park. There's still a law that says you can't have more than 20 people without a permit. And I remember them enforcing that on the people before Occupy. So that's like done. Like cops don't fuck with you anymore, at least at least in the Occupy milieu. All right, so there's a limit to public space. Because the thing is, public space isn't just about gathering and like forming an identity or having an antagonistic public sphere. It's also about social reproduction, the reproduction of material life. And that's why Occupy Wall Street wasn't just an agora, it was a commons, because people were living together and supporting each other's lives. The kitchen and all that wasn't just a cute little supplement, right? That's deep. That's how Occupy Sandy happened, because people learned how to set up kitchens, right? Actually sustaining lives. So it's not to dismiss public space and the traditions of thought, but it is to say commons brings it into a more radical mode. And housing being really housing and land. Okay, real crucial. Banksy, thanks for raising that. Maybe we can talk about it after. I know you're kind of saying time, but on Banksy, like, it's our fault for not having leveraged cultural capital better during Occupy. We totally could have gotten Banksy to do stuff. Probably Shepard Fairey made the cover of Time magazine that was really nice about the whole 2011. Shepard Fairey just made a banner for the Free Cooper students, which is really lovely. But that's a whole discussion that I'd love to have another time. Is how you leverage cultural capital in the art world and in the music world and in academia. It's organizing. It's not, you don't go out and like, we're going to organize the people in the grassroots. Like, we all need to organize ourselves. You know what I'm saying? Including people with a lot of cultural capital. So Banksy, I think he's dumb. I think he's like a pseudo-situationist, as my like snotty art critic perspective. But I would totally like use Banksy if we could ever get in a room with him for like some cool political shit. So.
One last story. And then now that I see that rainbow stairs, when we were doing these projects, we were approached by an association related with the gay community in Istanbul, and they just wanted to know what was going on with Gezi Park, and they wanted from us to make a presentation to them. And when we did that presentation, they told us that Gezi Park was really important for them. I'm quoting them, that they used that park to find other partners. So there were some hidden layers that we can see now, but I think they're really important when you start digging it up, and that may not be at the first time visible, but these are the things that make the park important. I can tell. Okay. The stair was this was actually a project of one guy who was working in a district called Karaköy, who had this project of just painting one stairs that was in their neighborhood with that he had this design, and he just implemented it. And it became a phenomenon immediately. Like, people started taking photos in front of it, Instagram hashtags and everything. But the thing that changed the situation was the action of municipality, that after this became viral, they just painted gray everything. Like, they just wanted to erase this thing, which they called, which probably they associated with the protest. So after that, people just wanted to hold on to this image and started painting the stairs in different neighborhoods of Istanbul, and this somehow turned into a symbol.
I can end the story. The thing is that afterwards, actually, the municipality decided to paint it the same colors again. So that was actually one of the most kind of interesting things that happened over the summer, that on this case, actually, they stopped insisting. So I think they actually organized the neighborhood to paint it together, but the problem was, it wasn't really well appreciated because the colors weren't right. So then the so then the original painter got back and he painted it again. Now, it's actually, we're neighbors in Studio X, so that's there. So hopefully, if you guys are ever in Istanbul and swing by our space, you can also get your picture taken next to the rainbow stair.
I was just emailing friends in Istanbul about what were their favorite things, and they were all sending me great slogans and pictures. And some of my young lesbian friends said, like, you have to show the stairs when you're at the panel tonight. So I don't know if we can scroll up or down, but if you look on it later, you'll see there's lots and lots of stairs on that picture. It's really nice.
All right, thank you so much for tonight, for the discussion. I think we can continue while we're having lit drinks. And all right.